The question of friends or enemies is an interesting one, and I think it's also an important one to make conscious. Are the facilitators the enemy of their client, Dane Rose? Are the facilitators the enemy of the team? Are the team the enemy of the facilitators? Are the board of directors the enemy of the participant, the public, represented in this case by Dane Rose? Is Dane Rose the enemy of the board of directors, of the facilitator body, etc.? Is it a relationship of enemies? Or is it a relationship of allies? And this is one of the areas where psychological illiteracy is really apparent, because when you cannot break down distinctions in agenda and persona, you tend to have a very simple identity politics or an identity position, because one can occupy a position based on affinity. For example, Sarah Sandhill saying that she will always put her husband ahead of anything else. So that's an associational affinity. And so anyone then in a conflict with Peter becomes Sarah's enemy. You're defending a person. There's also the loyalty to a position, where anyone taking this position, I'm with them, and anyone who doesn't take the position, who takes this other position, I'm in tension with them. But a more in-depth analysis reveals that we all have different parts, different inner ages, and different archetypal energies. For example, one part of me every single day wants to be lazy. Now, I find watching media to be lazy. Why? Because it takes me out of my thoughts, and I'm not thinking, I'm just observing. So there's my lazy part. Well, obviously, anything anyone does that increases my workload is the enemy of my lazy part. And there's also the goal-oriented part, meaning there's a part of me invested in achieving certain goals. So anyone who gives me something to do that helps me with one of my goals is the enemy of my lazy part, but the friend of the part of me that's interested in the goal. So you can see there's a split within each person. There's the part of me that's lazy, and there's the part of me that wants to achieve my goals. There's the part of me that wants to follow every law and every protocol, driving on the right side of the road, stopping at stop signs, calculating taxes exactly, filling out the forms. There's the part of me that wants to fill out and be in compliance with every law. And there's the part of me that is skeptical of the energy waste that comes, for example, in housing law. There's a strong part of me. My engineer told me that by law, he has to engineer my house to the 100-year earthquake. That's normal around the world. But then in San Francisco Bay Area, he has to double the calculation. That's unheard of in his world. He builds skyscrapers in Pakistan and Australia. He says, build it to the 100-year earthquake and then double it? That's law. And that particular law costs me an additional $75,000, which would give me no value whatsoever if the 100-year earthquake hit, because it's already designed for that. And the 200-year or double the 100-year, we haven't experienced that. But I have a lot of things I can do with $75,000, then pour it in holes in the ground in the form of expensive concrete to satisfy that law. So there's the part of me that wants to follow every law, and there's the part of me that wants to rebel against the absurdity of generating a housing crisis where there's no low-cost housing. Low-cost housing in Marin County is $650,000. That's the definition of low cost, because you cannot legally build a structure for less. So if you believe in following all the laws, you believe in minimum prices of $650,000 for all new construction in Marin County. We know that that's correlated with a growing trend in homelessness, and I think it's criminal that people lose their houses simply because not everyone can afford working at Google, etc., and someone flipping hamburgers or doing an internship or being an artist cannot afford $650,000. So there's a split. You have the pro-law, and you have the pro-let's house all our people without going bankrupt. And so if we understand that these are just surface examples of the many distinctions inside every human being, you may not agree with rape, but if your brother is guilty of 3 rapes, you may believe in family more than you believe in prosecuting rape perpetrators. Why? Well, maybe your brother, what is the reason? Because some people will turn their brother in and say, I'm standing for a position of a world without rape, and you, brother, have crossed the line. So I'm not gonna hide you from the authorities, because the only way I'm gonna get the world I want, which is a world with less rape, is if serial rapists are accountable for their crimes. So there you have a loyalty to position rather than a loyalty to association. Then, of course, you have liking the person, how much you like them. I don't really like my wife, so I'm not going to defend her. Or I don't really like my wife, but I'm still going to support her position not to be raped, because I don't want that for anyone. But I'm not going to support her position to, complain vehemently to anyone who writes a bad review when I live with her every day and she's late all the time, and the bad reviews are she's late. So I'm going to support the person who's writing a review that my wife is late, because I believe in truth. And if someone wants to hire my wife knowing that she will be late at least 50% of the time, then great. But if timeliness is really important, why shouldn't they get the data up front? So what's important to understand that is that in a fractious cult, in a fractious culture, we often have a variety of different strategies or different identities. An identity is a habit of thinking, feeling, speaking, and doing. And each identity is formulated in a given environment on a continuum of ideal and expediency. So if you're surrounded by crocodiles and you believe in trust and peace and all of that, if you live by trust and peace and all of that and extend a helping hand to the crocodile that bites it off, and then you turn the other cheek and the crocodile bites it off, you're going to be dead. And so, there's expediency, which is what works the most, what gets rewarded the highest amount of time, which in a sociopathic environment is often sociopathic behavior, is often the behavior that gets rewarded. And the focus should be in a sociopathic survival protocol to become bigger and bigger so that more of the reptiles around you fear you, so that they will do what you want them to do, what's good for your survival, not because they like you. Crocodiles don't have empathy, but out of fear. And that works in a reptilian paradigm. Now, the brain is such that depending on the degree of trauma, which correlates to the amount of abuse, everyone has a reptilian brain. Highly abused, traumatized people who do not get support have the reptilian brain as the primary operating system. Now, with rationality as an overlay, this can involve incredibly sophisticated action, seduction on the part of a woman, set up for crime for a lover. There can be very elaborate displays of empathy or consideration through rational analysis. But the feeling, the driver, is reptilian. And the display of empathy is purely to secure enough trust so that, because backstabs are more efficient than frontal assaults. If you can stab someone in the back, they put up no fight and they fall before you have to deal with resistance. So as a reptile with a rational frontal lobe and forward thinking, you can do certain things that elevate trust so that your scam can be more effective. And the bottom line is that if someone is a reptile, they have experienced enough betrayal, enough trauma, enough abuse in a helpless state in the growing up process that the empathic brain, which is very normal in an infant to start coming online. I mean, the unregulated transcendence of an infant is profound. There's no language, there's no paradigm yet, there's no body memories. Particularly, it may have happened in the womb. For example, my mother, when she was quite pregnant, fell off a bicycle and landed on me. And so obviously those types of things influence an infant's sense of safety and the levels of trauma. As does my mother have trauma literacy to calm herself down, or does she spit out the chemicals that induce PTSD and trauma because she doesn't know how to respond to shock or accidents in a cult that doesn't teach its people the science of biology, the science of emotions, the science of trauma, the psychology of a response to something like that. It doesn't teach self-soothing. You may have stumbled across that, but not many 19-year-olds have stumbled across the pearls of wisdom that can help them avoid the pitfalls, the landmines of a psychologically illiterate and somewhat sociopathic cult. So we have a variety of ages. We have a variety of archetypal energies. We have a variety of identities that are formed out of these archetypal energies and that exist at different ages. There are certain things you can get, for example, whining works very well at 5 years old with certain parents. But once you're 23, if you whine to your customers, the exact same context and situation, you may be punished for the thing that kept you alive when you were 5. Well, once the environment shifts, you develop a new identity, a new pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, and doing. And so these identities are, accessible. And when you regress, when something happens that triggers a traumatic memory, you can go back to the identity of the past. Now, there are protocols for managing shame in a shame-based cult. There are protocols for managing trauma. There are protocols for managing conflicts. There are identities and systems. And the entire history of environments and the things that have worked, that have helped someone survive and feel secure and have some sense of love and belonging, or at least survive. And there are identities when we're dissociated in shock and in the reptilian brain, and in the limbic brain, and in the rational brain, and in the empathic brain, and in the transcendent brain. So depending on which area of the brain that we're referencing, depending on which inner age we're connecting to, depending on the coping strategy that we've developed, different things at different times have worked. And when they work, when they're rewarded, they become a habit. And that's all an identity is. It is a habit of thinking, feeling, speaking, and doing in a given context that allowed the human being in question to meet their needs. Now, within a split cult, meaning when you're rewarded for whining at age 5 and then you're humiliated for whining at age 15, you've now got two diametrically opposed identities. You got the younger whining identity and the other one, I'm tough identity, because that's rewarded maybe as a 15-year-old jock. So these two are not going to agree. If you engage with the whining persona, they have a certain protocol around that. If you engage with the tough, I don't need anyone persona or identity, you have another pattern. And then you have, different agendas that, again, usually tie in with the environment. An agenda is, I want this to happen so that this will happen so that I can get my needs met. And the agenda, the goals may be the same, but the agendas, the strategy of getting there is different. And one of the biggest sources of conflict in a traumatically illiterate world is the same goal, different agenda, which means both people represent the other. They represent the conflict of the unknown. Now, anyone who's been traumatized and who has not dealt with the trauma competently is terrified of the unknown, because everyone with unresolved trauma, and unresolved helpless trauma, is the single biggest arena of chronic, unnecessary suffering for the human species. Now, every human being wants to feel sustainably better and wants to avoid feeling chronically worse. And the lowest level of human state, or the highest level of human suffering, is chronic, helpless trauma. It doesn't get bigger than that. Now, the trauma in many ways disconnects us from the transcendent and the empathic brain, which disconnects us with our higher self. The higher self sees the innate connection between all energy patterns and functions intelligently, empathically, and synergistically as if we are one. It is a state of tremendous ecstasis because you're breaking through the artificial wall of isolation and separation built by the cult paradigm, by language, and the conscious mind. The ego is the partitioned, distinct self that is separate from the underlying ecology of its species, of its family, of its environment, of the energy patterns, of the different dimensions of energy that are above and below the dimensions of energy that our senses can measure. This is the wound, so to speak. In some ways, you could say that a cult or an ego is a traumatic symptom. Because when you're in the transcendent brain, which is inside every human being, and this is both inside as a region, there are also chemicals lodged within the brain that, when triggered, produce transcendent experience. DMT, which is one of the most powerful compounds for dissolving the illusion of language, in which you reconnect with a field that is bigger than the species, that is bigger than the individual. DMT is inside, referred to as endogenous, every human brain. And when you have certain dreams, when you fall in love, when you have certain experiences, that chemical is released to create ecstasy. The stasis of the partition, the blurring of the boundary, the merging, the reconnecting, the relationship of energy to where one starts to identify and be aware of the patterns of energy that are coming in and the patterns of energy that comes out. Trauma robs our access to that awareness because trauma is an unregulated energy that is bigger than the human ego and thus threatens the human ego, and that violates the survival of the self, or the perceived violation of the self. People who commit suicide because they are incited with hate online have identified with their online profile to such a degree that when their online profile is trolled, humiliated publicly, they cannot hold their identity. They go into that virtual world, much like the virtual world of our ego in relationship with all of the ideas that we use to place mark our reality. And it's overwhelming. There's 50 people or one malicious person who's just incessantly violating the identity. This is who I want to be. This is who I present myself, but it's violation, violation. I can't hold the identity. I feel helpless. My identity is collapsing under the weight, under the presentation of outside pressure that I cannot control. It feels bigger than me. I can't hold it. So as my identity dies, as my pattern collapses that I identify with, I feel like I'm dying. And in that feeling of helpless death, I'd rather just finish it off physically as well, because I cannot maintain my state. I cannot maintain my identity. So this happens in rape, it happens in violence, it happens in, all kinds of different, impacts and approaches. So the real question is not, is Dane and the facilitator in conflict? But which parts, which identities in Dane are in tension with which identities in the facilitator body? Which identities and strategies and agendas of the board of directors are and are not in tension with the facilitators, with the public, with the legal system, with themselves? Which parts of Dane and which agendas of Dane are in conflict with which other agendas and identities within Dane? Because when you have a complex self, and particularly when you have a schizophrenic cult that is internalized into a schizophrenic ego, no matter what you do, you're in conflict with something. I used to experience it a lot in the dating world, where, for example, a woman's body might show extreme symptoms of arousal, but her mind said, it's way too soon. So there's a split there. And the question is, since you're divided, which part do I want to ally with? Now, in Western cults, the mind is the primary identity, because the Western cult is built around language, which elevates thought. So the identity that people reference in the West primarily is a thought and verbal identity. Whereas in certain other cultures, the identity is more the feeling and the body. Now, it's generally a good idea, if you're going to partner with someone, to partner with their dominant identity, even if the dominant identity is not as intelligent as the secondary identity. Meaning, my opinion is that in many cases, the secondary attention, many times the body is wiser, not always, but many times the body is wiser than the mind. But if you're in a Western cult where you define yourself with your positions and your ideas more than your well-being, I mean, if you look at America's political debates, in many cases, no one is enjoying themselves. That's not the point of identity or position-based identity. The point is to maintain one's identity in the face of chaos, change, and difference. Because there's a strong urge, and it increases for traumatized people, there's a strong urge to hold one's identity. So if one identifies mostly with one's thoughts, with one's beliefs, with one's ideas, with one's dogma, with one's paradigm, that's your primary identity. But you allow your body to do something that violates that position, you feel violated. Because it violates the position that you had. For example, if you have a mental line that I'm a slut if I do this, but I'm a valuable person if I do this, that may have nothing to do with the body sensations. But nonetheless, the cost to your identity, if you behave in a way that you consider to be a slut, which in our cult is a shameful term, meaning most people, oh, I don't want to be that. Why? Well, because that's a bad person. Well, I don't agree with it. Well, in a cult, there's also tremendous environmental influence. Because if everyone humiliates you because you've crossed the line into what is a slut, then if the humiliation, shame, and abuse is overwhelming, there is a strong incentive to move from being internally referenced to externally referenced. What's the incentive? Well, as a human, we need the other people to survive. We need survival, security, love, and belonging. Well, what happens if you go to the grocery store and we don't serve people like you around here? People like me? Yeah, people like you. This, and this. Okay, so this, and this is not welcome when I go shopping. Is that correct? Okay. I have no problem with this, and this. But I do have a problem not being able to buy food. So maybe in order to survive, I will give up my own view of this, and this, so that I can pay attention to what 95% of the people around me are saying, which is that this, and this is bad, because I want a job, I want to be promoted, I want to be respected, and I want to buy food. And if I egregiously violate the taboos of 90% of the people around me, sex with children is one of them. Keith Raniere of the Nixium cult, had periodic sex with children. He thought it was fine. He was self-referenced. But it was part of what led to multiple life sentences and his probable death, because most of us don't think it's fine. And most of us are too psychologically illiterate to come up with a better boundary than age. Now, obviously, 18 is not the best distinction. There are people in their 30s that have no business having sex at all, let alone with this or that type of person in this or that way. But they're over the age of 18. You can make the boundary, are they at choice? Will a 6-year-old agree to perform fellatio if I give her a chocolate bar? Are they at choice? But that's not a very sophisticated distinction either. Plenty of individuals will welcome abuse. I had several girlfriends that I had to disconnect with because they actually rewarded me with smiles, praise, time, and sex if I was more abusive, if I criticized them more, was sarcastic, got angry. Suddenly, they smiled and wanted to have sex with me and had all the time in the world. They gave me everything I wanted if I would only abuse them. But is that the line? Not only are they at choice and saying, yes, they're welcoming, but what if people are choosing to reward behavior that is scientifically correlated with statistical harm? What if someone will only have sex with you if you'll drive over their foot with a tank? Does that mean that because they're over the age of 18 that's fine? That, of course, their feet are ground up in no time, but somehow they have a fetish about that? Is that the distinction? Should a mature 17-year-old be thrown in jail for having sex with another 17-year-old? What about a childish 50-year-old? What about a traumatized, regressed 3-year-old in an 80-year-old body? What's the line? You see, we're psychologically illiterate, and so we don't have a sophisticated model to answer that question. And so we just put it here. But there are people marrying 14 years old in different parts of the world. There are people with multiple spouses and no spouses. And the science that says that 90 times out of 100 a benefit happens based on these metrics in this situation, but 70% of the time a negative occurs with these metrics in this situation, we're not very good at thinking, let alone deciding, well, which measurement's right? You know, the Quran allows multiple wives, the Bible doesn't, or no, the Mormons do, but not these people. So which is, and if you believe it's right, if you believe it's the right thing to do, and the placebo effect kicks in, which has often outperformed many of our best drugs, just the very belief that it'll work or that it is the drug, a sugar pill, can give you 40% instant relief. And the actual drug can give you 40% instant relief. Is it the placebo? Is it the drug? Where's the distinction? If you believe having sex as a 14-year-old is beneficial, a rite of passage, if you believe that cutting off your genitals as an 11-year-old is an initiation into femalehood, if you believe that chopping off the foreskin of your son in a traumatic event without any choice is what? Well, just the way things are done? Does that alleviate the negative impact rather than if you believe you're mutilating your child? Where's the line? Well, we're not even taught to think. But obviously, the most aware and intelligent amongst us understand that a core human drive is to feel sustainably better and to avoid feeling chronically worse. And that the identities or patterns or habits we develop are often what brought about some movement in that direction at a certain time. Now, when these habits are institutionalized with beliefs, you noticed that being masturbated at age 6 by your aunt felt better than being hit by her. Well, by all accounts, physiologically it would feel better to be masturbated at 6 years old than to be hit. And if on top of that, ice cream and lollipops and little, my goodness, someone's actually paying attention to me. Now, if that awareness of that particular pattern is institutionalized in a belief that sex with children is harmless, or the belief that incest is love, or the belief that 6-year-olds can have a mature relationship with 40-year-old women, if it's institutionalized into a belief, beliefs tend to create blindness, because you expect, that's the nature of belief, it's really a predetermined expectation. And if you expect something, there's always some aspect in the reality that validates your expectation. If you expect something, let's say you expect that the universe is a friendly place. This was Einstein's highest question. Is the universe a friendly place? If it is, your life is completely different than if it isn't. So it's the most important fundamental belief, because it affects whether you're interested in the unknown, if you're interested in the universe. If the universe is not a friendly place, you want to stay as small as possible. Why? Because the universe is bigger than you. And if the universe is not a friendly place, then you're in a sociopathic paradigm. It means, figuratively speaking, the universe is a snake. The universe is operating with fight, flight, freeze, and dominance. It's not operating out of empathy. Because if the universe's primary program is empathy, the universe is a friendly place. Because empathic people, that's the definition of friend. Someone who cares about you. Now, the law of mass dictates that when two energies collide in a sociopathic paradigm, meaning without attunement, in a domination paradigm, when two energies collide, the bigger one always sends the small one flying. The pinball bounces off, the bowling ball continues. Now, the obvious conclusion is that if the universe is a scary, frightening, and unfriendly place, number one. Number two, if it's 1 trillion times bigger than you, number three, you're done for. So how do you avoid the intimidation of vast patterns of energy that you don't understand, that are bigger than you and you can't control, and that are fundamentally unfriendly? Well, you stay small. I don't want to leave my town, and I don't want foreigners coming in. I don't want to look at other religious beliefs, and I don't want my religious beliefs to change. If you put the brakes on all change and stay as small as possible, this is my daily routine and I'm not budging. These are my beliefs and I'm not looking at any facts to the contrary. It is an effective response at mitigating the terror of an unfriendly vastness that is incomprehensibly big and complex. So, self-referential, small people that defend their position dogmatically believe that the universe is an unfriendly place. That their best strategy, given that effect, is to stay as small and self-referential as possible, so that at the very least, the horrible things in their environment are expected and predictable. They're not, I don't want to study asteroids and find that, some god or demon is throwing asteroids and the planet could blow up at any moment. We don't, oh my goodness, I just want to do my little thing, turn away when anything confronts me, not read that, the analogy of the Catholic bishop who wouldn't look through Galileo's telescope because the Old Testament God is a sociopath who treats his children more brutally, more sociopathically, more compulsively, more of the silent treatment, more revenge and bitterness than 95% of our parents for all time. So if you're dealing with a reptilian sociopath as a projected deity in a father projection, and of course we tend to project the deity as the biggest power. We take whatever is the biggest power in the cult, which for a few thousand years has been the patriarch. And to the reptile, power is the ultimate value, because it determines life or death in a reptilian framework. If you have power, you live. If you don't, you die when you're around reptiles. The one who has the least power is consumed the fastest and most efficiently by those who have the most power in a reptilian sociopathic paradigm. Well, trauma induces the sociopathic paradigm. And one of the best ways to maintain a civilized cult of reptiles is to maintain a balance of power where I'm not going to violate these rules and boundaries, because then there's a high price to pay. It's not out of empathy. It's, I would abuse you, but then I'd have to deal with the police. I would abuse you, but then you'd abuse me, and you're about the same weight. And so reptiles don't seek confrontation. They run from things bigger than them, and they fight things smaller than them, and they freeze when neither of those options work. And so the Cold War was basically peace through freezing. That's a good correlation with freezing. I will kill you at the same time you kill me, so we won't fight. We're both reptiles. We're not caring about the Russian people. They're not caring about the American people. Rather, the operating software is reptilian, and we've created a stalemate of freeze. I'm not going to run from you because I'm not smaller than you. I'm not going to fight you because you're not smaller than me. I can't bully you. We're equal, so we freeze. It's called cold, the Cold War. It's a war of two reptiles. And the exact same dynamic goes on with your neighbor or your business partner. If I can, as a venture capitalist, manipulate everything to such an extent where I can get all the profits and steal the software and cut you out of the deal, and I'm a reptile, well, then I do it. But reptiles always pick on people that cannot hurt them. They don't pick on people who can hurt them, because that's not what reptiles do. It's fight what is smaller, run from what is bigger, freeze in the meantime. So the question is high the enemy of Dane? Is Dane the enemy of high? Has to be broken up. Every position, my position that clients of therapists should not be sexually abused by therapists, my position that therapists should not escalate psychedelic doses beyond the comfort zone of the client, my position that clients should not be made secret keepers of the marital infidelity of their therapist. These are positions. And High's position is that these things should happen. Now, there's the position of words and there's also the position of behavior. Because obviously, if Peter Sandhill does repeatedly sexually abuse a client, does make his client a secret keeper, does push for a higher psychedelic dose, does not disclose his licensability, obviously, he's not doing that in a vacuum. It's not like just popped out of nowhere. A series of events have happened in his life that made those behaviors the dominant choice in Peter's psyche. Meaning, Peter's commented to me at several points that he had another voice in him that said, don't do this. Or I had another voice that almost did this, but he didn't do it. Why? Because Peter is going to side with the operating system and protocols that have rewarded him systematically over time, that have helped him form an identity. He's learned in his environment that most people will keep his secrets. And if you have a secret, then you can have your pie and eat it too. If you don't have a secret and you betray someone, then they get annoyed, and so it discourages the betrayal. But if you have a secret and then they don't get upset because you didn't tell them the truth, well, then you have the benefit of their trust and you have the benefit of the violation. Meaning, I have the benefit of my wage that comes from you trusting me, but then you also embezzle from me, and you have the opportunity to embezzle because you're nearby, because I trust you, so I'll behave in a way on the surface that I'm very trustworthy, but then I'm going to embezzle as well, and I'm not going to tell you, because if you knew I was embezzling, then you'd fire me, and I wouldn't have the opportunity to embezzle. It's like my foreman who I fired, last year. He kept stealing jobs. And the protocol is, if someone asks who does this work, etc., you have to give them a card and introduce them. But he wanted the work on the side. And it got to the point where his quality to me deteriorated because he was making more money on the side from the jobs he was stealing. So I fired him. Now, initially, he thought he would go up because he was making good money with me, getting good exposure to jobs. People were liking his work because they were my designs and I managed him. And he was making more money stealing the jobs on the side. And he thought he would just magically continue to make more money on the side. But he doesn't have any jobs to steal at the moment because I'm not hiring him, which was the basis, the platform upon which he could steal jobs. So he's not doing nice jobs where people come by and say, who did this work? Can you come work for me? he's sitting at home, and people don't come by his house and say, how about you sit at home in my garden? And so not only does he lose then the salary from me, but all the side jobs disappear as well. So it was a weak position to respond arrogantly, like, I don't need you, I've got jobs on the side, without understanding the foundation he stood on. And the person I replaced him with does a good job and doesn't steal the work. And so these dynamics are in tension. I had nothing against him. I liked the guy. I had nothing against Peter Sandhill. He's a great personality. But if Peter Sandhill violates his high agreement and violates his marital agreement, he's stealing a job in a certain way, because he wouldn't have had the opportunity to work with me if High had not trained him and recommended him. And he wouldn't have had an opportunity to work with High if Sarah hadn't brought him into High. So he betrayed Sarah and the facilitators, but they rewarded him for that. They put his interest ahead of their customer. Well, that has impact. Just like I fire my foreman, and I understand Peter and Sarah have left High at this point, but initially they kept on. That was after I mentioned that I would be suing, and then that weakens their position. It's coming out of fear. So I think the real tension and the real question, because you have people you like and you have people you don't like, and you have groups you belong to and groups you don't belong to. And those are simplistic, instinctive, childlike associative points. I really like you, so whatever you do to my money and bank account, just have at it. I love you so much. In other words, I'm a child. I trust you through the innocence of a child's eye, and I want you to be my parent and take care of me. And this invites the reptilian element in human beings. It goes on all the time. I'm part of this group, so I'll defend the group. I'm an American, so America is dropping bombs on Iraq. America is committing Abu Ghraib. America is killing 1 million innocent Iraqi civilians. Doesn't matter. I'm an American and I stand by my country. It's my group. Or you have a position and you stand with the position. Well, I have a number of systemic positions, meaning I believe if you stand for a position, no theft or no rape at High, whatever it is, you cannot say that you stand by the position and reward people for doing it. You have to create an incentive structure that supports the position. So with High's position that they don't have to take any responsibility for when a facilitator sexually abuses a client, it means they have very little incentive. Obviously, they know it's happening repeatedly, but who cares? The client pays the price for that. So if you really are strong in your commitment to a position, you don't reward the opposite of your words. And so I wouldn't expect a High facilitator to come out publicly saying we support sexual abuse of High facilitators. I think their position is more like, oh, well, it's going to happen from time to time, and we don't want any liability, and we'll try and hush it up. If it doesn't hush up, then we'll scapegoat the facilitator, but we won't actually spend the time and money to see that it doesn't happen in the first place. And then it'll just happen again. So it's on the expedient continuum of that position. And that is sustained with the position that they, the individual facilitators, don't have to pay any price. And so it's not a big deal because they're not paying the price, the client is. And so in a sociopathic framework, it will only become a big deal for high when the specific people involved find that some part of their own lives isn't working as well. Like, it wasn't an issue for Peter when I complained to him directly about the sexual abuse and many other things. But it became a huge thing for Peter when I told his boss that and showed them the recording. That was a huge, because there he was on recording, cavalierly lying to his wife, lying to High, behaving like a complete lunatic relative to his role, and charging money. Well, his current position is the same. His position is, okay, I made a bad one, sorry. Why don't you pay to fix my stupidity? I'll keep the money you gave me. You pay to fix the stupidity. And I say, well, that's rewarding you, Peter, for being a moron. Now, if I be nice to Peter's moron and nice to Peter's lazy side, I'm being cruel to his next victim. You see, and so I'm a friend to Peter's decency. I'm a friend to Peter's education. I'm a friend to the next victim. I'm a friend to High's mission. I'm a friend to science. I'm a friend to the public's right to choose. I'm a friend to psychological discipline. I'm a friend to statistics. 99% of the time, you have sex with a client, it doesn't go well for the client. Therefore, it shouldn't happen because the client hiring the therapist is not hiring the therapist with the goal of their life deteriorating. So if there's a 99% chance it will, as a result of having sex with your therapist, it's the professional's job to know these statistics, to be competently trained, and to use their professional influence to ensure that the cross-wired strategies of their client, and in this case, I never would have gone anywhere near there, except for Peter's high push for 2 psychedelic compounds and all the dissociation. That was a new identity. That identity had no fear. That identity couldn't think clearly. That identity was not culturally based. That identity was dissociative, and MDMA and mushrooms does that. So that's the job of the professional. So these are in Peter's interests. Well, they're not in his lazy interest. They're not in his lies and his blindness interest. They're not in his, coping addictions and all of those. You could say that Peter's lies, ignorance, coping addictions, cruelty, self-absorption, whatever it is, these positions are not friends with those. But the greatest art in integrating the self is the way that the self makes deals. And this is the function of good democracy and bills in politics. So how do you integrate the fact that my lazy part doesn't want to be making this video? with the fact that the part of me that has goals of a more traumatically literate cult does want to make this video. One of them is not going to lose. Well, you know, in politics, you come to the middle. So I'm lazy half the day and make this video the other half. That's one way of doing it. But the other is education. The other is science. Because most of the suffering I've experienced in my life that has left me working incredibly hard, including the systemic ignorance of High's cult and untrained leadership body, most of the greatest suffering I've experienced has come from ignorance, stupidity, shame-based sociopathic behavior, and fear. I work my ass off to get around, whether it's my parents or High or various people in our cult, our government, because it takes so much energy. It takes so much more energy to try and be happy within a sociopathic framework of ignorance and incompetence than it does to be competent and empathic. So, the more I work at creating a psychologically literate cult, framework of belief that is more complex and more literate, the more I advocate that for positions that even if they're just initially mental, obviously, if anyone at the facilitator body was an empath who understood the hierarchy of priorities, and the hierarchy of priorities says that if you are an organizational leader who was invented, whose role was invented to serve the public comes first. And your organizational agendas of secrecy and reputation come second. Meaning, if your whole basis for existing is to serve the public, but in reality, you harm the public to protect your organization, you've got your math wrong. And eventually that faulty math leads to your house collapsing. And that's it. So you've got to learn that or your house is going to collapse. And you can learn it slowly, and I've given them 6 years and plenty of videos and stuff. That doesn't mean they're going to learn it. But, there is, if you embrace solid mathematics and adopt this, then it doesn't have to destroy the house. It just means you can catch up to it. You have to keep learning and studying and stuff. So these, projects, etc., are allies with competency, with science, etc. They are the enemy of high shame, secrecy-based defense strategies, etc. And, the same is true in reverse, that Peter's protocols are the enemy of my well-being, but they're also the ally of my teacher. I asked Peter Santel in the psychedelic session, I said, please help me bring my gifts into the world. Well, as a self-absorbed narcissist, that went right over Peter. But look what he's done. He behaved so terribly, so consistently, that every time I think of letting this go, I think, no, this is not in anyone's interest. Everyone's losing here. I've got to do something. Well, what do? I read psychological data. I do the math. I look inside. I look at this, compare it with what goes on in other situations. I figure out what went wrong. I figure out what needs to improve. And then I teach. So thank you, Peter, for forcing me out of my shell to be a teacher. I asked Peter at the peak state in psychedelics, help me bring my gifts into the world. Now, he didn't have the character to do that directly. He didn't say, I'm honored to be asked, what are your gifts? How can I help you bring them into the world? That would be an empath or a real friend. He said absolutely nothing and proceeded to try and blame me for everything that went wrong and teach me his insanity. But his insanity got so painful that I had to dispense with it, and through all the pain of PTSD and grief and heartbreak and stuff, find my own way. And you can't teach anything until you find your own way. So is Peter Sandhill the friend of my friend? Not as I would define friend. Is he the friend of my well-being? Are his protocols the friend of my well-being? Certainly not. Are they the friend of sanity? No, they're not based on science. They're profoundly divergent from reality. But are they the friend of my teacher? Well, as a shy, highly sensitive, conflict avoidant, traumatized person with attachment disorder, the last thing I want to do is to get into controversial subjects with a large group of people, understanding that some of them are operating primarily from the reptilian brain, which means that because I'm an individual and they can gang up, that this invites a certain amount of attack. Is it comfortable? No, but I asked Peter to help me bring my gifts into the world. Has he delivered? Well, 2,000 hours of video, 40 YouTube channels, a nonprofit, a philosophy of relationship, a 10x relationship course. You betcha Peter has delivered. By making it so painful and so uncomfortable to stay silent that I felt I would die, and nearly did, if I did so. And so here I am. So it's not simple, these things. Your enemy may be your greatest friend, and always is in some areas. The government hires the best hackers to try and hack their system and pays them money for revealing their vulnerabilities. In other words, it takes some maturity. Elon Musk just paid a teenager $20,000 for hacking into a Tesla. Why? Because that port is no longer open, and Elon Musk cares enough about the safety of his drivers that he doesn't want to risk anyone being hacked into and losing control of their cars. So the enemy, the hacker, has become the ally of public safety because someone had the leadership to do that. But it takes a very strong person to honor their critic, to honor their adversary. You know, the Japanese do a beautiful job of bringing in the bowing, because the Latin for compete is to draw out the best in the other. In a healthy competition, in a debate, of position, of science, both people grow. The compete brings out the talent in the other. Well, obviously that's hard to do if high disowns the issue, but of course they cannot do that in court. And so if you're protecting shame by not engaging with the real question any leadership needs to engage with around this whole thing, which is what are the best practices based on science? That's the only question any competent leader is asking in this whole domain. Now, does Hai have to ask that question more because of all these videos or less? Of course. So this is an ally of Hai's leadership. Now, will that leadership take center stage and transform the organization into something 10 times more effective than it was in its past? It depends on their relationship, on their paradigm, on who they're rooting for inside each one of their psyches. Because in order for the leader to emerge, the shame must be sacrificed. In order for data to emerge, the ignorance has to be sacrificed. And if you've made lots of mistakes, and they have, like most of us, if you've made lots of mistakes, you cannot afford to welcome in the data that can help you win, because the data will reveal the profound level of incompetence, of ignorance, of incompleteness that your paradigm, your structure, your protocols are based on. It's a crisis of identity. And the question is the consciousness capable? Are the egos willing to step up to the challenge? If not, like me, they die. If I wasn't able to take the curveball of financial collapse, health collapse, PTSD, being led in the exact opposite direction of my well-being by all of my therapists, losing my entire community, business collapsing, that's a pretty big curveball to try and follow the parental figure into oblivion. If I didn't dissociate from Hai and associate with something, science and data, I'd be dead, homeless, on the street, sick, hopeless, insane. Just as is a possibility for each individual facilitator as well as the organization that clings to the insanity, to the ignorance that brings things to this particular point. And we all have that freedom. Which identity, which known something or other do we hang on to? What position do we let go of and what position do we embrace? And is it because someone has a nice smile or tells a good joke, or is it because we follow science, or is it because we're related, or is it because they did something nice to us and now they're asking for a favor? You know, you loaned me $100,000, now you want me to get you some opium. I don't want to turn you down. But when they end up dead on the floor, was it really a favor? It was to their addict, but was it to their humanity or the family they left behind? So the question is not, is the public an enemy of Hai, or is Hai the enemy of the public? The question is not, are the facilitators, or Peter Sandelin specific, or Sarah, or whatever, the enemy of Dane, or vice versa? The question is, which of the positions that are being occupied lead to the best statistical correlation to well-being? And which parts of Dane are the enemies of which parts of Hai, and which parts of the facilitators and boards are the enemy of which parts of Dane? For example, the fear and paralysis of the board of directors and the incompetence of the board of directors is the enemy of a safe public that has a right to know that a facilitator is behaving like a sexual predator under the influence of psychedelics that they're inducing. Public can make safer choices if they know that. It's the board's job to put the public first. So the ignorance and fear of the board of directors is the enemy of public safety. But are they the enemy of public comfort? Because give me the American that wants to know the nitty-gritty of the difference between abuse and competence when they could be watching TV. And so the board of directors is serving the laziness and the ignorance of the public, in a public that to a large extent would like to be lazy and would like to be ignorant and would like to trust a parental figure and then blame them when it goes wrong. It's just that the public's well-being will not improve when that part of them is pampered and served. And it will improve when a challenge says, hey, read 500 hours of literature here. Look at the science and align yourself with best practices. That's not the enemy of character and of decency and of empathy, but it is the short-term enemy of the lazy part. Where the lazy part comes in, though, is when you have a more effective model of reality. When you have a more effective model of reality, it takes less energy to achieve sustainable well-being. And the more people that come on board, the less energy it takes. And the less energy it takes, the more people want to come on board. So it becomes a virtual... And pretty soon you can be lazy legitimately. You don't have to be a 911 operator saying, I'm not going to answer that call, I'm tired. If you work your ass off to create a cult where there's less 911 calls, now you can take a nap and not abandon anyone. But you have to study the data to design that new system that eliminates the problem you are causing passively and unconsciously by tolerating the ignorance, the shame, the fear that doesn't actually work. So I don't feel in any way that the teacher, the data-driven, the research, the safety advocate is the enemy of anyone except the shame and the lazy parts in each one of us that wants things to go away magically without taking the responsibility, the ability and willingness to respond, to actually create the world that eliminates the unnecessary problems we are working so hard through cult norms to perpetuate.